In the previous section you learned how to manage items. Now let's deal with triggers. In this video I will show you how items and triggers are connected. You will learn what kinds of triggers can be configured. We will add a trigger and see how we can track the status of that trigger. Other monitoring systems have their items and triggers connected. For example, if you monitor the number of running processes, you would also configure an upper limit. But Zabbix treats items and triggers independently. In a common setup, you will use many more items than triggers. You can always take a look at an item's history to find out what happened last night or to see a trend. But not all items are worth sending an alert. But what is a trigger anyway? It defines whether a certain condition of a computer is undesirable. Basically, it reads the history or latest value of some items, does a little computation, and in the end tells Zabbix whether the result should make you concerned. A trigger will not send you an alert email, but it's the necessary basis for an action. When a trigger fires, it may trigger an action that in turn sends you an email. Let's take a look at existing triggers to give you a better idea. Triggers belong to hosts, so I'm going to Configuration Hosts, and I'm clicking on the Triggers link on the host fry. Every line represents one trigger. You see that a trigger has a severity that can be used to run different kinds of actions depending on how bad the problem is. It has a human-readable name, and you see that these triggers are inherited from different templates or even automatically discovered. The expression is the machine-readable definition in Zabbix syntax. Let's take the trigger called lack of available memory. The human-readable name uses the host.name macro to add the host name of the host having problems. Otherwise you would get an alert message and couldn't tell which host is affected without checking in the Zabbix web interface. The expression simply compares two values. The expression in curly brackets is evaluated and compared against 20 million. See the documentation on unit symbols to see what other units are supported. The syntax to access data is the hostname, a colon, and the key of the item with its parameter. Don't get confused. This part of the expression refers to the entire history of values that recorded how much memory was available. To get the latest value from the history, you need to apply the function last of 0. And finally, you can compare the latest value to 20 million, and the trigger will fire if there are less than 20 million bytes of memory available. The documentation on trigger expressions gives you a complete reference of trigger functions and more complex examples. The expression constructor below is a nice feature, especially when you are creating or debugging complex expressions using multiple items or computing averages or deltas. In this simple example, you can enter a value to test the expression. When I enter 42, you see that the value is less than 20 million, so the trigger expression is true. Instead, when I enter 30 millions, it tests to false. The multiple problem events generation checkbox lets you create a new event on every evaluation of the trigger instead of keeping its state, but you will rarely need that. The description field is very useful to give your coworkers additional information on what this trigger means and maybe also tips on how to fix the problem. The content of this field is available as the trigger.description macro in alert messages. The URL can be used to point to documentation, for example, and is shown in views that show triggers. The severity sets how bad this kind of problem is. You can use it freely. The severity is also used in actions and user media. For example, you could define an action that sends you an email for all kinds of triggers with a severity of at least warning. And you can make Zabbix send an SMS for all triggers having a high severity. And you could alert the entire team of system administrators for disaster kind of triggers. Please note that there is no update interval defined here. Zabbix will evaluate every trigger expression every time that one of the referred items changes. And if time-based functions like no data are used in the expression, Zabbix will check the expression every half a minute. Let's also take a look at the current state of triggers. You already know that the latest triggers are shown in the dashboard. To get a better overview, go to Monitoring Overview to see a table showing all trigger states. The green boxes show triggers that evaluate to false, so there is no problem. The yellow boxes show active triggers. If you click on a trigger, you can choose to see the event view that shows the history of this trigger. Or you can acknowledge this problem if you are using the acknowledgement system. Or you can see a graph of the referred item. You can also set the type from triggers to data to see the latest value of the referred items. Monitoring triggers takes you to a list of all active triggers. You can use the filter here to limit the display. I'm usually just showing the unacknowledged triggers with a severity of at least warning. The view shows the current state of your triggers, and it allows you to acknowledge multiple triggers using the bulk acknowledge feature. I'm usually keeping this view open the whole time. It also gets reloaded automatically. If you rather want to see the history of triggers, you would go to the Events view. Every column leads to another view with further information. For example, the date link leads to a view showing acknowledgements, comments, the trigger history, and what actions have been run. So much for this video. You learned what a trigger is, how it refers to items, and how trigger expressions work. And you learned how to get an overview of the current state of your system.